Particularly in the Baltic states, there have been multiple instances where Russian spies have been, or people believed to be Russian spies have been caught trying to gain access to military areas. So it's clear that they are not only trying to gain an advantage by weakening the political systems of NATO members, but also trying to get ahead of the curve by having a greater understanding of their military capabilities.
Jeremy Griffin in for Hugo Rifkin on Times Radio. It's just coming up to 12:20. Now, check out the Times today for a fascinating long read on Russian spies and hitmen deployed across Europe by Russia's three resurgent intelligence agencies. We're talking state-sponsored murder, cyber attacks and political destabilisation with an activity level comparable to the height of the Cold War. Tom Ball is one of the writers of that piece, and he told me that assessments of Russia's security services had changed since the country's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
In the first few months of the war, it was considered that the Russian security services had massively failed in essentially preparing the ground for the invasion of Ukraine. And it was clear that Putin was very angry with his security services, who are, he's a former FSB director himself, so it's one of the areas of state that he takes a very great interest in. Compounding that is the fact that following the invasion of Ukraine, a lot of European nations expelled a number of diplomats, or diplomats in inverted commas, estimated to be around 600 of those people who were expelled from European capitals. So the picture is in 2022 was that people thought that Russia's security services were essentially a paper tiger and that it's not the kind of fearsome beast of the KGB or the Cheka before it, but was actually a much reduced force. And then B, it was felt that what powers they did have been much reduced. 2 years on, both of those things now seem to be wrong-headed. The FSB over the last 2 years, the FSB and the GRU and the SVR, which are the three agencies have been seemingly going into overdrive with operations being foiled on a near weekly basis now across the entirety of Europe.
Yeah. You mentioned the three agencies. What are the differences between those three Russian spy agencies?
The FSB, which is the successor to the KGB, is the internal security agency, so the equivalent of MI5 in this country. But it also has a remit overseeing countries of the former Soviet Union. And there's the GRU, which is military intelligence, so a kind of crossover between, I guess, the SAS and MI6.
And listeners may remember the GRU with regard to Salisbury, yeah?
Exactly. Yeah. It was a unit within the GRU, which is thought to have carried out that attack. And then the third is called the SVR, which is their foreign intelligence branch. That would be a kind of straight equivalent of MI6.
Russia has long been accused of state-sponsored murder, including Alexander Litvinenko, of course, and the Salisbury poisonings that we just mentioned. Is President Putin directly involved in planning and sanctioning that sort of activity?
I think probably not planning, but given how much we know about his interest within the security services and his long-standing connections to them, I think it's almost certain that he would be sanctioning them.
And what sort of activity other than that are these agencies getting up to? I mean, having read your piece, they're really into political destabilisation, aren't they?
Yeah, and that's kind of, as I write in the piece, it's in the very kind of DNA of these security agencies, or the DNA of Russian foreign policy more broadly, because dating back to the early Soviet Union, when the Bolshevik government was essentially ushered in by a small group of people who were causing political destabilisation, that was then followed up by attempts to export the revolution by similar means. So it's something that the Russian state has been engaged in for over 100 years now. And yes, as you said, political destabilisation is the end goal, and so that may be achieved by assassinations or by sabotage or by, as we see increasingly, by cyber means. But the end result essentially is to try and divide populations, promote politicians and groups within foreign countries that are sympathetic towards the Kremlin, and to destabilise those groups which are not so sympathetic.
How do you feel the activity levels compare to the Cold War as we would know it?
It's thought that the level of espionage and attempts at political destabilisation and operations in foreign, especially European countries, is at the same level as it was during the Cold War, if not greater.
Wow. I'm interested in the realpolitik aspect of your story too. You explain in Brussels, the very nerve centre of the European Union, sits the permanent mission of the Russian Federation to the European Union, and it's basically run by a spy, or believed to be run by a spy. And a couple of blocks away, you write about the roof of the Russian embassy in Brussels, which bristles, as you describe it, with satellite communication equipment. Brussels, of course, hosts NATO as well as the EU. What possible advantage is there to Europe's leaders of tacitly permitting Russian espionage at the heart of the continent?
Well, firstly, let's just say that was written by Bruno Waterfield, my colleague
Excellent
in
Brussels correspondent at the Times, yeah.
I wouldn't want to take credit for that. But yeah, as you say, there is a realpolitik element to this, and the man that you referred to is the charge d'affaires in the Russian embassy there. And as I said earlier, there were 600 Russian diplomats who were expelled, but this man wasn't, because of the fact the EU would have to do so, and they weren't willing to do that because they feared that their own ambassadors in Moscow would then be expelled in retribution. So there's a certain level of horse trading that goes on in diplomatic circles, and broadly speaking, nations tend to be aware of the people within foreign embassies in their country who are spies, and sometimes it pays to know that, to have that situation whereby you have known nobles rather than unknown nobles. There's also cases where you have those who can't be expelled. So as we see diplomats being expelled, we now have Russians who are believed to be Russian agents moving into Europe through organisations such as UNESCO and other kind of non-overtly diplomatic agencies, but those which there is a quota to be filled, and Russia's security agencies are filling those with their agents.
And the West knows about it. So is that sort of the acceptable side of spycraft, if you like? Yeah,
that's always been the way that there's a kind of gentleman's code in a way that you have an understanding of who's operating and doing what, and you kind of those are the acceptable rules of the game. But that's kind of been turned on its head because of the war and because of those expulsions. But
I was going to ask, actually, how much of this escalation do you think is directly related to the Ukraine conflict?
I think it's directly responsible for it. Russia now feels that it's, if not necessarily a hot war, then certainly a warm war with the West. And one analyst said to me that the reason they're doing this is because they do believe they're in direct conflict with the West, and this is their spy agencies being on a war footing.
I think you say in the piece, you think Russia is casting around for weaknesses that it could exploit in the future or in future wars.
Yeah, I mean, there are, particularly in the Baltic states, there have been multiple instances where Russian spies have been, or people who believe to be Russian spies have been caught trying to gain access to military areas. So it's clear that they are not only trying to gain an advantage by weakening the political systems of NATO members, but also trying to get ahead of the curve by having a greater understanding of their military capabilities.
And the very fact that it's an important election year around the world. France, obviously, United States. We had the presidential debate on Thursday evening, the election about to take place here on Thursday. Have you seen, or is there any evidence of Russian attempts to influence and interfere in those processes so far?
Yeah, I mean, in France, there was an example, a very ostentatious example, when 3 men put coffins draped in French flags in the centre of Paris, and this was a couple of weeks after Macron had tried to talk up the idea of potentially sending French troops to Ukraine, and these 3 coffins had French soldiers in Ukraine written on them. So it was a clear kind of attempt to undermine Macron's message. And there have been other instances as well. I mean, the sort of thing that appears to be the Kremlin's favourite tactic at the moment is getting so-called pranksters to phone up leading politicians around Europe and convince them that they're actually talking to another politician from another country. And then
that's happened with Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister.
It happened with Meloni. She thought that she was talking to some diplomats from Africa. It happened with Lord Cameron as well recently too. And the Kremlin would deny, obviously, that had anything to do with them. But how did these pranksters get hold of these numbers? How would they, the logistics involved in it clearly indicates that there was some intelligence agency that was helping them.
That's Tom Ball, and that long read about the strength of Russia's intelligence agencies is in today's Times. Get it in the paper or with a digital description at thetimes.com. Did I say description? Subscription.